Thanks, everyone. This is a very vulnerable space, so don't worry, there's nothing that can go wrong here. I'm Matt Kissane, and I'm from Landor Fitch. Landor Fitch is the world's largest brand consultancy, and we are a very proud part of WPP. We don't have any robots today, unfortunately. And I'm here to talk to you about a topic that I often feel vulnerable discussing in front of new audiences, and that is indeed vulnerability. And specifically how vulnerability makes brands transformative and creates enduring competitive advantage. So why do I feel vulnerable about talking about vulnerability today? Well, to start with, when I arrived this morning, I saw my cousin's husband here, who turned out to be on stage just before me, going through 5 words which apparently you shouldn't use in any of your marketing. So I got here and I was like, oh shit, what am I going to do if he says vulnerability is one of the words? But luckily he didn't, so I'm good. But actually the reason I often feel vulnerable talking about vulnerability is because I found that it's actually a very polarizing term. As I've gone around and shared this thinking and talked to people and presented about it, I've seen that some people embrace the notion wholeheartedly and others reject it outright. Simply, it doesn't seem to be for some people, particularly when it comes to brand and business. Just curious, do we have any vulnerability skeptics in the room today? Anyone thinking, what the hell is this guy up on stage talking about? Show of hands. We've got one in the back. Okay, we'll see if we can convince you before the end of the session. So why do we talk about vulnerability at Landor & Fitch? Because fundamentally, we're on a mission to create brands that are transformative. And what does that mean? That means brands that create a market change in someone or something in order to really help to drive competitive advantage. That might be a change in their corporate culture. It might be a change in a customer experience. It might be a change in a customer perception. It might be a change in a way that a company decides to go to market. And we actually think that these brands are all transformative. Airbnb, Neste, Levi's, Coinbase, NASA, the famous Patagonia, Zaha Hadid, Avis, Beyonce, and Ukraine. And I'm going to talk to you about some of these examples as we walk through the presentation. And I'm sure that these are many brands that you as marketers have cited in many of your presentations and meetings over the last few years. God knows how many times we've seen that bloody Patagonia logo pop up in presentations every which way over the last 6 months. And I promise I won't labor the Patagonia point too much. But while all of these brands are extremely and wildly different, doing different things in different sectors, facing different challenges, we believe the one thing that really unifies them is that they have embraced vulnerability in order to be transformative, and they've embraced vulnerability in order to really cement a kind of legendary status for themselves. So what do we mean when we talk about vulnerability? Well, I'll get the dictionary out quickly. So vulnerability is defined as the act of exposing yourself to the possibility of failure, criticism, or harm. So why on earth am I making the case for vulnerability in this context? Because after all, brand decisions have never been more consequential. You as CMOs, as marketers know this, right? We're facing challenges which are existential today. We're looking at climate change, we're looking at war, we're looking at social justice, racial equity, we're looking at the collapse of ecosystems. These things are huge. So obviously we can't just go out there and put ourselves even more at risk, can we? Because actually the stakes have never been higher. We know this, that a single ill-thought-through tweet can really lead to mass cancellation. So our response as marketers in the main has been to damage control, to cancel proof, and to bubble wrap our brands, preferring the 100% probability of being not wrong over the, let's say, 40% chance of just being oh so right, striving to be perfect rather than striving to be thrilling. We've sanitized and perfected our so-called authentic, purpose-driven identities by eliminating the nots and the nevers from our brand vocabularies. We heard about that just now in the session on the 5 things to avoid in writing. We see this drive to remove negativity from our language as marketers because we're scared that actually talking in the negative is going to reveal something about ourselves that we don't want to show to the world. And as we heard in that session, that's simply not the case. We're just protecting ourselves with a veneer of positive perfection. We've also done other things. We've engaged in cancel-proofing exercises. We've showed up at Prides and Black History Month, not in the spirit of true allyship, but for fear of being seen not to be involved at the right moment. And we've shied away from making the leaps and jumping into the deep ends that we as human beings, as individuals, we know are character building. We know that character is forged when you're standing on stage, you've got 50 people in front of you and you're thinking, God, how am I going to get through this? That is the reality of a character building thing that we don't see enough brands embracing. In short, we've been perfect. We've been great at being perfect. Brands have done a really, really good job at being perfect, but we need to understand that perfect is no longer fit for purpose. We need to cast aside this over-engineered perfection that we have been honing for the past 10, 20 years, because we are in the age of imperfect action. Today we live in a new paradigm, one characterized on one hand by an era of perma-crisis. It feels like we just lurch from one crisis to another, right? We had the pandemic, then we had the war, we've got inflation. All of this is backed by political turmoil and polarization and ecosystem collapse. And all of this stuff feels very dramatic. So on the one hand, we have this state of perma-crisis. On the other, we have this exponential opportunity, this AI technology, which is really offering huge new opportunities for us, a green industrial revolution, which is well underway, and the reshaping of society for greater equity and justice. So we have these two opposing forces, perma-crisis and exponential opportunity in this new paradigm. So what does that mean for us? It means we need to embrace vulnerability in three ways. We need to be more creative. There is no more vulnerable act than being creative. There is no more vulnerable act than originating a new idea, voicing it, putting it out into the world, and waiting to see the reaction you're going to get. You sit there with bated breath and you wait for people to tell you you're going to fly or you're going to fall. But ultimately, we need to be more creative if we are going to create our way out of crisis. Secondly, we need to be much more imperfect. We live in the age of imperfect action. We need to take urgent, imperfect action to solve the crises and meet the challenges that we face. But we can't do this without being vulnerable. If we sit there and make a perfect process all day, every day, we'll never get anything done. Sometimes it's better just to leap, not know if you're going to get it right, but get it done in the main anyway. And we need to be more authentic, because fundamentally, as AI outsmarts us and blockchain causes us to confuse transparency with trust, we're seeing a primal desire for more multidimensional, warts and all humanity, human realness being resurgent. So the answer for us is really to reject perfection, which is an enemy of creativity, which is an enemy of imperfect, urgent action, and an enemy of fully dimensionalized character, and to embrace vulnerability. So what does it look like to embrace vulnerability? Well, I don't have the secret answer to give you here. There is no one way to embrace vulnerability, but there are many ways to practice vulnerability for brands to powerful effect. Firstly, you can attempt to first. I was driving through the Sahara Desert. I was not driving, I was being driven last week, and that was a very scary and vulnerable thing when you're 2 hours into the desert and you're wondering what happens if the car breaks down. But I was on the way and I was reading a book about something called mimesis, which is the study of how imitation has really driven human civilization and progress. And it was talking about the fact that actually attempting a first is near on impossible. It's really difficult because that's not how things work. Doing something second, doing something third, fourth, fifth, sixth, this is actually very easy. Doing something first is very, very difficult. But doing something first, attempting something new, is a hugely vulnerable act. But I'll take you through some examples of how attempting a first has really paid off for brands, creating enduring competitive advantage and creating legends. Secondly, you can shatter a taboo. You can say the unsayable. You can radically accept that an accepted status quo doesn't work anymore, that it's a problem and that you're going to fix it. But doing this takes going against the grain, and that in itself is a very vulnerable act. Thirdly, you can favor, as I've mentioned, imperfect action over perfect process. Throw away your timing charts, throw away your racy matrices, and just act. That is vulnerability. And then fourth, embrace all of your dimensions. Embrace the bad sides of yourself as well as the good sides of yourself. Brands are like human beings. They have good sides, they have bad sides. They're beautiful and they're ugly. And ultimately, as AI is going to very quickly outsmart us and outperfect us, what we know as human beings is it's not going to be able to out-emote us, out-insecure us, and out-vulnerable us. So let's future-proof ourselves by really embracing vulnerability. But irrespective of the way you choose to embrace vulnerability, what we know for a fact from the examples that I'm going to show you is that vulnerability and the embrace of it helps to create legends for brands. And I'll just take you through a few examples. We'll start with the one that everyone knows. Patagonia's owners reinvented capitalism, right? By making the planet the company's only shareholder. Can you imagine how scary this was the day before they did this? What the hell are we doing? Okay, let's go for it. Every dollar not invested back into Patagonia is distributed as dividends to protect the planet. Now, this announcement, as you know, broke the internet. It pretty much broke the entire marketing industry, right? I don't know who didn't quote this in a meeting the following day, the following week, the following 6 months. And ultimately, it's changed the entire paradigm for how brands create shareholder value. This was vulnerability. This was attempting a first. What about Airbnb? Airbnb is a great example of imperfect action over perfect process. Now, remember just when the pandemic was winding down and the global C-suite was arguing about return to office, what's the right hybrid working practice? How many days? Should we do a mandate? Should we not do a mandate? And it seemed like this interminable discussion that just kept going round and round in circles and no one had the answer. And then one day, Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky put out 105 words and said, you know what, guys, just work from anywhere. Now, this wasn't perfect. There are lots of tax issues, which we know go along with this, and it's not a silver bullet solution to the future of work. But what it did was it threw the gauntlet down to many other brands and said, listen, this is one way that we're going to try. It might be imperfect, but we're going to do it, and we're not going to spend hours, days, and weeks debating. We're going to see how this works. What happened? In the 5 days following that announcement, the Airbnb careers site received 800,000 new unique visits. Pretty good, especially in the Great Resignation. What about Levi's? Levi's shattered a taboo. They shattered the taboo of fast fashion. You know, Levi's was like any other fashion brand, you know, doing well out of fast fashion. But they said, we're going to call time on the era of fast fashion. We're going to shatter that taboo. We're going to say it's wrong for people to continue to buy 10, 15, 20 pairs of jeans a year when one will do. So with the Buy Better, Wear Longer campaign, they encouraged their customers to consume less. What happened? Well, the ad was the best testing ad that they had run in a decade, and in early 2023, they beat Wall Street earning estimates, and they've really got an upbeat sales outlook forecast for the year ahead. What about Coinbase? Well, remember the days before the QR code, everyone. Remember the days when you didn't scan a QR code in a restaurant. I mean, what was that like? So Coinbase was very, very quick to jump on the QR bandwagon, because ultimately what they did was they paid for an expensive Super Bowl TV slot and put nothing but a QR code there. Can you imagine? I mean, that's really a leap of faith, and that is attempting a first in its purest form. And Coinbase downloads jumped immediately, 309% in the moment after the ad, and next day kept on climbing 286%. So you can see how it paid off. What about NASA? NASA is truly one of the best examples of attempting a first, imperfect action over perfect process. I was reading an article in the Financial Times lately which said that the cost-benefit analysis of the moon landings would have grounded the crew. If they'd actually looked at what they were trying to achieve, they never would have got off the ground. There was just no justification for even trying. But look at what the Apollo missions brought us. They didn't just create that iconic moment in human history, but they created camera phones, they created baby formula. And when we look at NASA in Landor Fitch's brand asset valuator, which is our proprietary database which tracks the brand health of different brands, we could see that NASA today remains one of the strongest brands in the whole survey. Zaha Hadid. Zaha Hadid is a great example of someone who leaned into all of her dimensions. Her designs were often derided and ridiculed. She was labeled a demanding old diva for sticking to her guns and demanding the excellence that she knew that she needed. Posthumously, she has a brand power which goes beyond nearly any other architect in the world. She remains the most followed architect's practice on social media, and her brand stretches from furniture to clothing to design. She did not compromise her personality. She showed herself in all her dimensions, and her legacy lives on today. What about Beyonce? Beyonce ditched the traditional marketing cycle in 2013 when she simply dropped an album out of nowhere digitally with no advance announcement, no advance promotion. It became the fastest selling album in iTunes history, #1 in 100 countries, and established Beyonce, according to the popular press at the time, as the most daring and innovative record executive in the industry. So she repositioned herself with that act of vulnerability, that leap of faith. And then finally, Ukraine. Now, I worked in Landor, Moscow 10 years ago, and this is something that I often feel conflicted about today. But back then we used to work in Ukraine, and we often used to find people didn't know a lot about Ukraine, and they didn't really understand what the country was all about. But I think now what we've seen is how the open, innovative, communicative leadership style of Zelensky has really shaped an image of Ukraine in the popular imagination. And we can certainly see how they've leaned into what was probably considered to be weakness as a strength at the beginning. They said, we need your help. We're going to stay and we're going to fight, but we need your help. We're going to lean into our vulnerability. And I think that's what the world has responded to in such a powerful way. What I find fascinating about vulnerability is this quote, which comes from Breanne Brown, the world's leading vulnerability researcher. And she says that vulnerability is the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I want you to see in me. And I feel this holds true for brands. We look at all of those brands that I've shown, and I hope that you think that many of them are brave and many of them are daring and many of them are even legendary. I certainly do. But I think it's difficult for us when we're running our own businesses and thinking about how to do things for us to embrace vulnerability in our daily practices. But I really want to just finish this presentation with a call to action to say, as marketers, we need to be more vulnerable, because being more vulnerable will make us more transformative. And hopefully in doing so, we can all create more legends and figure more on PowerPoint slides in different summits around the world. So with that, I am going to end the presentation, but I want to ask a question to the group. We've been thinking a lot about what vulnerability means for us as a company as well. And I'm sure, and I hope that over the course of this presentation, you may have started thinking about what it means for you. So I'd like to throw the question open to the floor. When you think about your sector, the sector of activity that your company operates in, how could there be more vulnerability displayed there? What are there issues where you feel you could look to be more vulnerable in the coming months and years? I'll start. I think I need to put myself out there. I feel vulnerable about AI. I feel vulnerable about AI because when I look at what it can do, I understand that a lot of the generative stuff that we create, a lot of the outputs, a lot of the deliverables, this can ultimately be done by AI. And I've had to sit down and think about the fact that ultimately we as individuals will need to reposition ourselves. We'll need to think about how we ask better questions. We'll need to think about how we are more emotionally sensitive to our clients and how we help them, guide them through change. Change management is emotional management. And ultimately, I think we need to learn to understand that our job will be really about helping clients to make better judgment in the future. And certainly we won't be focused on did we deliver you a fantastic new name or a fantastic new logo, because to some extent those things will be able to be done by AI.